In a city that once built more cars than entire nations, there are houses right now that a county government will sell you for $1,000. Not rent. Sell a 3-bedroom house, walls, roof, a real address, for less than most people spend on a used refrigerator. The catch is not the price. The catch is that almost nobody wants them, even at that number. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why an American house can be worth less than the door it hangs on. Before we get into the empty streets and the auction listings, I want to say something to the people who click on videos like this one every week. If you are the kind of person who finds a strange comfort in maps of vanished places, in county records and population charts that only ever point downward, you are in the right place. And I would love it if you stuck around and subscribed, because there are a lot more of these stories coming. So tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from tonight? Now, let us go to Flint, Michigan, and start where this whole story of the shrinking house begins. Flint sits along its namesake river in eastern Michigan, a grid of once proud brick neighborhoods built for a workforce that no longer exists at anything close to its former size. In 1908, a carriage builder named William Durant founded General Motors here, turning a lumber and wagon town into the birthplace of the modern American auto industry. Buick, Chevrolet, and later a sprawling assembly complex called Buick City rose along the river, and by mid-century, Flint's population had climbed past 200,000, nearly all of them tied to a General Motors paycheck. Then came the long unwinding, starting in the 1970s and accelerating through the 80s and 90s. General Motors closed and consolidated its Flint plants, chasing cheaper labor elsewhere and eventually outside the country entirely. At its late 70s peak, roughly 80,000 people worked for General Motors in Flint. By 2006, after another round of buyouts, that number had fallen to around 8,000. Buick City, the plant that once symbolized the city's identity, produced its final car on June 29, 1999, and was demolished within a few years. Flint's population today sits at roughly 95,000, less than half its peak, with poverty above 40%. This is where the $1,000 houses come in. The Genesee County Land Bank Authority, formed to deal with the wreckage of tax foreclosure, now sells vacant homes through a program generally priced between $1,000 and $3,000. The idea is not charity, it is triage. Officials there have said they would rather see a family fix a house up and get it back on the tax rolls than let it rot and drag down the block. And that is the catch, because these are not move-in-ready homes. Most need a full gut renovation, a new roof, new plumbing, sometimes structural work running into the tens of thousands on top of the purchase price. Jobs outside healthcare and a shrinking public sector are scarce, and the city is still living down the water crisis that began in 2014. When officials switched the water source to the Flint River without properly treating it, leaching lead out of the city's aging pipes. A house here can cost less than a laptop. Living well in it is the part nobody can put a price tag on. Now travel south and west, down past the edge of Illinois to a spit of land where two of America's great rivers meet. And you will find a town that was supposed to be one of the most important cities in the country, and instead became one of its emptiest. Cairo, Illinois sits at the exact confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, protected by a ring of levees that make it the only Illinois city completely surrounded by flood walls. In the 1800s, this position made Cairo a natural hub for steamboat trade, and during the Civil War, Union General Ulysses S. Grant used it as a staging base for his campaigns down the Mississippi. Cairo's population swelled past 15,000 by the 1920s, and boosters genuinely believed the city was destined to rival Chicago or St. Louis. It never happened. In 1905, a railroad bridge was completed across the Mississippi at nearby Thebes, routing traffic around Cairo instead of through it, stripping the town of the crossing business that had defined it. Shipping and rail companies gradually left as highways and modern lines bypassed the town entirely. Then, in the late 1960s and early 70s, Cairo was torn apart by racial conflict, including boycotts and violence that drove out businesses and families who might otherwise have stayed. Today, Cairo's population sits at roughly 1,700, a decline of nearly 90% from its peak. Downtown storefronts sit boarded and silent, and steamboat-era mansions slowly collapse behind overgrown gardens. Homes here sell for strikingly little, often in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands typical elsewhere. The catch is written into the town's geography. Cairo's entire existence depends on levees holding back two of the continent's largest rivers, an infrastructure burden most small towns never think about. Jobs are scarce, larger cities are well over an hour away, and decades of disinvestment have left the tax base too thin for much beyond the basics. Cairo's location, once its greatest asset, is now the thing that keeps investment away. From a town drowning in slow decline, we go next to one that is, quite literally, still on fire. Centralia, Pennsylvania sits in the anthracite coal region of the Appalachian Mountains, an area that once produced the overwhelming majority of hard coal mined in the United States. The town grew up around its mines in the mid-1800s, reaching a peak population of around 2,500 residents by 1890. With more than a dozen active mines and a tight-knit community built entirely around the rhythms of the coal industry. By the mid-20th century, demand for anthracite coal had been falling for decades, and most of Centralia's mines had already closed. But roughly 1,400 people still called the town home in 1962. That May, borough workers hired to clean out the town landfill set it on fire, a routine task ahead of the Memorial Day holiday. The landfill sat directly above an old strip mining pit, and the fire was never fully extinguished. It spread downward into the abandoned coal seams beneath the town, and it has been burning ever since. Attempts to smother it, flood it, or dig fire breaks around it all failed, and by 1983 the state had already spent more than $7 million trying to put it out with nothing to show for it. The following year, Congress approved $42 million to relocate residents on a voluntary basis. Most took the buyout through the 1980s and moved to nearby towns. A stubborn minority refused, and in 1992 the state of Pennsylvania invoked eminent domain over every remaining property in Centralia, technically turning lifelong homeowners into squatters on land the state now legally owned. A handful of holdouts fought the decision in court and eventually won the right to stay in their own homes for the remainder of their lives. As of the most recent counts, that number has fallen to just a handful of people, and current estimates suggest Centralia may now have no permanent residents at all. There is effectively no real estate market left in Centralia, because there is almost nothing left standing to sell. The state owns the land, the zip code has been revoked, and the coal seam beneath the town is projected by Pennsylvania's own environmental regulators to keep burning for roughly another 250 years. If Flint and Cairo show what happens when an economy leaves a town behind, Centralia shows what happens when the ground itself turns against the people living on it. Let us head back to the industrial Midwest for a moment, to a city that was quite literally built from nothing to serve a single company, and then largely abandoned by that same company decades later. Gary, Indiana did not grow up organically. It was created in 1906 by the United States Steel Corporation, which chose an undeveloped stretch of sand dunes on Lake Michigan because it offered cheap land close to Chicago. The company built the Gary Works, for years the largest steel mill in the world, along with housing and civic institutions around it. Gary's population grew explosively, peaking around 178,000 people around 1960, making it Indiana's second-largest city and earning it the nickname the City of the Century. Automation and industry consolidation began eating away at steel jobs even before output actually peaked. Where the Gary Works once employed around 30,000 steelworkers, that number fell to around 7,000 by 2005. As jobs disappeared, so did residents, a pattern worsened by decades of segregation that had already confined much of the city's black workforce to older, undervalued housing even during the boom years. Gary's population has fallen by more than half from its 1960 peak, and roughly 1 in 4 parcels within the city now sits vacant. Property values collapsed to the point that entire blocks of once solid homes can be purchased for a fraction of what comparable houses cost in nearby Chicago suburbs, sometimes for a few tens of thousands of dollars or less. But the forces that emptied Gary out have made ownership complicated. More than 6,000 structures sit abandoned citywide. Jobs outside logistics and a shrinking steel sector remain limited, and poverty runs at more than double the national average. Investors have started circling in recent years, and prices have climbed off their lowest point. But for now, Gary remains a city where you can own real property for the price of a used car, and making it livable is the much longer project. Now let's shift industries entirely and head down into Texas, to a town that did not decline gradually over a century. It boomed and collapsed almost within a single decade. Ranger, Texas was a sleepy farming community of under 1,000 people until October 1917, when a well called McCleskey No. 1 struck oil and set off one of the most explosive boomtowns in American history. Within a couple of years, the population reportedly swelled to somewhere between 16,000 and 30,000, most of them men chasing oil field work. Pictures from the period showed derricks packed so densely that residents joked you could no longer see the houses underneath them. The boom brought money, and it brought the usual companions of a sudden oil rush too: gambling houses, saloons, and a level of lawlessness that made Ranger notorious statewide. It did not last. The wells that made Ranger famous were drilled into a formation that produced spectacularly at first and then dried up fast. By 1921, the boom was over. A wave of bank failures hit the town, and by the 1930 census, Ranger's population had collapsed to just over 6,000. A fraction of what it had been less than a decade earlier. The town limped along afterward on agriculture, peanuts, cotton, and sheep, stabilizing for a while near 3,000 people. But the broader migration of rural Texans toward interstate corridors kept chipping away at it, and today Ranger's population sits at roughly 2,500 and continues to shrink. Homes in Ranger today sell for a fraction of the Texas state average, many changing hands for well under $100,000. The catch here is less dramatic than a toxic mine or a burning coal seam, more a story of simple economic gravity. Ranger sits well off the interstate corridors that pulled population toward cities like Fort Worth and Abilene. Its original industry vanished within a few short years, and the jobs that replaced it never matched oil boom wages. It is a quiet, affordable town today, mostly because the world that made it famous burned out faster than most cities take to build a single skyscraper. If you have made it this far, you have probably noticed a pattern by now. one industry after another rising fast and then leaving just as fast, and taking the people with it. I've spent a lot of hours going through county assessor records for videos like this one, and I will admit the sheer repetition of that pattern still catches me off guard every time. If that kind of pattern recognition appeals to you as much as it does to me, go ahead and hit subscribe. Because we are only halfway through tonight's list, and the strangest stories are still ahead of us. From the flatlands of Texas, let's head up into the mountains of western Oregon, to a town that tried something almost nobody else on this list managed to pull off, reinventing itself after its founding industry disappeared. Oakridge, Oregon grew up as a company town for the timber industry, against the western foot of the Cascades along the Willamette National Forest. Through the middle of the century, mills processed a steady stream of Douglas fir from the surrounding mountains, and the population swelled through the 60s and 70s on timber wages. A local welcome sign once proudly called Oakridge the heart of the timberland empire. The empire did not survive the century. The Pope and Talbot Mill, the town's primary employer, shut down in the 1980s amid a broader Pacific Northwest timber collapse driven by automation, changing federal forest policy, and new logging restrictions. A smaller successor mill closed in the 90s, and Oakridge was left, in the words of one former city administrator, a distressed and very poor community. The city bought the old mill site, tore down what remained, and spent years searching for something to replace the industry that had built it. What Oakridge found was mountain biking. Hundreds of miles of old logging roads, useless for industry, turned out to be extraordinary terrain for riders, and the town has rebuilt part of its economy around outdoor recreation. It is a genuine partial recovery, but the numbers stay stubborn. Oakridge's population today sits at roughly 3,200. Median household income hovers near $40,000, and nearly a quarter of residents live below the poverty line. Home values have climbed with renewed interest in rural mountain living, but Oakridge remains, by Oregon standards, one of the more affordable places to buy property, a legacy of decades as a company town without a company. The catch for anyone drawn here by cheap mountain views is a 45-minute average commute to any real job market. Now, let's go somewhere genuinely strange. A town in West Virginia that most Americans have simply never heard of, built entirely around a railroad and almost entirely gone. Thurmond, West Virginia sits deep in the New River Gorge, wedged onto a narrow strip of bottomland between a cliff face and the river itself, so tight that the town's entire commercial district was built directly against the railroad tracks with no street in between. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway completed its main line through the gorge in 1873, and Thurmond grew up as a critical fueling and switching point for coal trains heading out of the surrounding mountains. At its peak around 1930, this town of a few hundred people generated more freight revenue passing through it than the entire cities of Cincinnati or Richmond, with as many as 15 passenger trains and roughly 4 million tons of coal moving through annually. For 20 remarkable years, Thurmond was, pound for pound, one of the richest small towns in America. The decline came from two directions at once. Diesel locomotives began replacing steam engines, which needed far less servicing and fewer stops. And the coal industry that fed the rail traffic began its own long slide as demand shifted. The symbolic end came in 1930, when the town's Grand Hotel burned down, and by 1935, Thurmond's last bank had failed and closed its doors for good. The town was, by most accounts, already a virtual ghost town by the 1950s. Today, Thurmond's population sits at somewhere between 0 and 5 residents, depending on which census year you check. and most of the surviving structures are now owned and preserved by the National Park Service as part of the New River Gorge National Park. There is no meaningful housing market in Thurmond today because there is almost no private property left to buy. The National Park Service controls most of what remains, preserving it as a kind of frozen snapshot of a 1920s Appalachian coal town rather than a place anyone can move into. The catch here is not price, it is access. Thurmond was only reachable by rail until 1921, and even now, getting there means driving miles of winding mountain roads and crossing a single-lane bridge. It is one of the only towns on this list you genuinely cannot buy your way into, no matter how much money you brought. And that brings us to the final stop on tonight's list. A place that does not just have empty houses. It has almost no houses left standing at all, and the reason why is the most unsettling story in this entire video. Picher, Oklahoma sits in the far northeast corner of the state, in the heart of what was once the richest lead and zinc mining district in the world. Mining here began in the early 20th century, and by the time Picher incorporated, the town had become the center of a mineral boom so intense that its population swelled to roughly 20,000 people at its peak. For decades, this corner of Oklahoma supplied a huge share of the lead and zinc used across the entire country, including much of the ammunition manufactured during both World Wars. The mining left behind something the town could never fully escape. Waste rock from the mines, known locally as chat, was piled into massive man-made mountains that came to define the landscape, some of them towering higher than nearby buildings. For years, children played on the chat piles and rode motorbikes across them, unaware that the material was saturated with lead, cadmium, and other heavy metals. By 1979, water seeping out of the abandoned mine shafts had turned nearby Tar Creek orange and killed off its fish population entirely. In the 1990s, researchers confirmed what many had feared, that roughly a third of the area's children tested positive for lead poisoning. The Environmental Protection Agency designated the region a Superfund site in 1983, one of the largest and most heavily contaminated in the entire country. And a voluntary government buyout program began offering residents money to leave. Many families held on anyway, reluctant to abandon homes their families had lived in for generations, until the ground itself made the decision for them in a different way. On May 10, 2008, a powerful F4 tornado tore through Picher, destroying a 20-block stretch of the already struggling town and killing several residents. For most of the holdouts who had resisted the buyout, that tornado ended the debate. By 2009, virtually every remaining resident had accepted a federal relocation payment. And on September 1st of that year, the town of Picher officially dissolved its own government and ceased to legally exist as a municipality. A tiny handful of self-described holdouts, calling themselves the Chat Rats, remained behind anyway. The most recent surveys count fewer than 10 people still living within Picher's former boundaries. There is, for all practical purposes, no house you can buy in Picher today, because there is barely a house left standing. Most structures were demolished as part of the buyout and cleanup process, and the chat piles that once towered over the town are slowly being hauled away for use in construction, a process expected to continue for decades. Federal officials estimate that a full cleanup of the underlying mine contamination could take another 50 years. Picher is not a town with cheap real estate. It is a town that the United States government decided, for the safety of its own citizens, should simply stop existing. Of everywhere on this list, it is the only place where empty is not a description of the housing market. It is the entire point. So why do places like this keep emptying out over and over in a country as wealthy as this one? The honest answer is that almost none of these towns failed because of one single mistake. Flint didn't fail because General Motors was cruel. It failed because a global auto industry reorganized itself around cheaper labor elsewhere, and Flint's whole identity had been built around one employer for too long. Cairo didn't fail because of one bad decision. It failed because railroads made rivers less necessary, and then people made each other feel unwelcome enough to leave. Centralia and Picher remind us that sometimes the ground itself simply stops being safe to live on, no matter how much history or memory is tied up in it. If you are watching this and genuinely wondering whether you could live somewhere like Flint or Gary or Ranger for almost nothing, the honest answer is that you could, but only if you do not need a job to already be waiting for you. Do not mind a long drive for real health care, and are prepared to spend far more on renovation than you spent on the deed itself. These are not vacation properties. They are second chances for towns that are still quietly hoping somebody shows up. So here is the question I will leave you with tonight. If you could buy one of these houses for almost nothing, would you actually move in? Or would owning it just be enough? Let me know in the comments where you landed. And if towns like this fascinate you as much as they fascinate me, stick around, because there are a lot more forgotten corners of this country still waiting to be found. This video is for informational and historical purposes only, and is not financial or investment advice. Property values change, and viewers should do their own research or consult a professional before making any purchase decisions.